This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Susie Gehring.
Fed-friendly stocks pop as the Federal Reserve calms concerns over when the central bank might start to raise rates.
Pricing power. The government releases a massive amount of data on Medicare pricing and the doctors who bill the very most. What it says about the system and what every patient and taxpayer should know.
And making your spending secure, steps companies are taking to protect your credit card data and the huge costs involved. We have all that and more on Nightly Business Report for this Wednesday, April 9th.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Go to any business meeting anywhere, and the reading of the minutes from the last session is likely to be the biggest snooze on the agenda. But not today, and not when the minutes come from a Federal Reserve meeting. Stocks catapulted at precisely 2 p.m. Eastern today when the Fed published the minutes from its March meeting. Short-term bond prices rose too. Why? Well, fairly simple. The minutes reaffirmed the idea that the Fed is in no hurry to raise interest rates. What's more, it was revealed today that new chair Janet Yellen was so concerned about fine-tuning interest rate guidance that she called an unusual pre-meeting video conference on March 4th to discuss the matter. The Dow soared 81 points on the day. The Nasdaq jumped nearly 71, an almost 2% spike for the day, and the S&P 500 added 20. Here's a look at the bond numbers on a bit of a mixed day. There's the 5-year note. You see the yield coming down there. The dollar index weakened a bit, and the gold prices briefly turned higher after the Fed's minutes were released, but they ended the day slightly lower. Steve Leisman has more on the Fed minutes and where the bank stands on when interest rates may start to climb higher.
The minutes of the Federal Reserve's March meeting suggesting that maybe the Fed wasn't as hawkish as some in the market believed at the time. The Fed saying it was concerned that the market would take the wrong signal from the individual funds rates forecast of its members. Those forecasts showed the Fed believed rates would be higher in 2015 and 2016 than the market had previously thought. It's a big problem for the Fed, where it says one thing in its statement about the funds rate, but also provides the individual forecast of its members. In this case, those were at odds, and it spooked the market into thinking rates would be higher. The minutes say the participants were concerned that that could be misconstrued by the market into thinking the Fed would be tighter than it otherwise would have been. The minutes say specifically that the public should follow statements, not the individual forecasts. All but one Fed member sees rates rising not until 2015 or later. A large majority of the Fed see a gradual rise to the funds rate when it does begin going up. There was further tapering expected throughout the rest of this year, assuming the economy continued to improve. And the Fed saw fewer headwinds to the economy this year and better growth. And they thought that the weakness in the winter was largely the result of the weather. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Steve Leisman.
Let's turn now to Lindsay Piensa for more analysis on the Fed, the economy, and the markets. She's chief economist at Stern AG. So, Lindsay, it seems like the Fed's message really didn't change. They just confirmed what they said before, that interest rates are going to go up gradually. Is that your take on it?
That's exactly right. The minutes reminded the market that it is the statement and not the famed dot plot that conveys monetary policy intentions. And the statement was very clear, very dovish, reaffirming the Fed's commitment to this very accommodative stance. And so the meeting minutes simply reaffirmed that dovish stance and reaffirmed to the market the Fed's intentions in terms of monetary policy.
So how do I take this statement today, these minutes, and apply them in my investing life?
Well, I think the market's reaction tells all. The market liked the idea that the Fed's the Fed's commitment to accommodation was reaffirmed. And again, what this says is that when we look at the monetary policy stance of the Fed against the backdrop of very weak labor conditions, very minimal income growth, despite the fact that the market seems ready and almost wanting rates to rise, it's more likely that the Fed remains at this accommodative stance longer than expected, meaning that the Fed could be on hold well into 2016, possibly even 2017, if we continue to see this very tepid pace of growth.
Mm-hmm. Lindsay, investors are always looking for some kind of headline to let them know that they're on track with their investments. I mean, what's the key thing that they should be looking out for? Is it something about the job market? Is it just overall the economy, housing? I mean, what are you monitoring?
it all comes down to jobs. And I think the Fed's adjustment to forward guidance really highlights how important recovery in the labor market is in terms of not only investment, but in terms of the Fed's guidance for monetary policy. And moving away from just looking at the unemployment rate, the Fed said, look, we have to keep an eye on average hourly earnings, which are flat at 1.9%, the average work week, which hasn't seen any upward pressure, the participation rate, which remains at a 3-decade low. All of these factors contribute to the broader health of the labor market, which gives us a very different, much more dire picture than does that civilian unemployment rate that's come down from a peak of 10%.
So, Lindsay, for those of us who love to get in touch with our inner Fed wonk, what, if anything, should we draw from the unusual video conference meeting that Chair Yellen called in advance of the main meeting? Does it signal anything about her tenure, her leadership, how she's going to do things, what she's concerned about?
You know, I don't know if we can really draw a conclusion from that. Remember, there was a lot of confusion after the March meeting, and I don't think Yellen or any individual member can be blamed for that. I think instead this points to the idea that the economy really is at a precipice. We've had very accommodative policy for an incredibly long time, and yet the economy continues to just bounce along. And so I think what the chairman's intention is to say, look, we're sending a very unclear signal. The market needs now more than ever guidance from the Fed. And I think in the backdrop of the confusion that came after the March meeting, she simply wanted everyone on the same page to make sure that a unified message was conveyed to the market, that message being a very dovish message.
All right, Lindsay, thanks for translating it all for us. We really appreciate it. Lindsay Piensa from Stern AG.
Well, despite today's gains, a weaker than expected report out today on wholesale inventories prompted J.P. Morgan Chase to lower its forecast for first quarter overall economic growth from 1.5% to 1%. But the bank did raise its outlook for the second quarter, which we're in right now, by the way, from 2.5% to 3% growth.
Well, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew says the U.S. is leading the global economic recovery, but he also says there's still a lot of work to do to get the American economy where it needs to be.
We took tough decisions, 6 years ago, and we stuck with them. We have our economy growing. We reformed our financial system. We have our fiscal house in a much better place, and we have, growth that is, by world standards, doing very well. As you know, by our standards, we still have a lot of work to do. As long as there are millions of Americans who want to work full-time or want to find jobs who can't, we're not done with our work.
Lew says kickstarting economic growth is his top priority when he meets on Friday with other financial leaders at the International Monetary Fund's annual meeting. It'll be in Washington.
And a real setback in President Obama's push for equal pay rules for men and women. The Senate voted against debating what was called the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would require federal contractors to disclose how they compensate workers and bar any retribution against employees who discuss their salaries with coworkers. Some lawmakers argued the bill would lead to frivolous lawsuits and deny women flexibility in the workplace.
Some good news for Detroit today. The bankrupt city reached a settlement that'll give some bondholders nearly 3/4 of the almost $400 million that's owed to them. Kevin Orr, the state-appointed emergency manager, says the deal and plans to exit bankruptcy protection in October could influence other creditors to reach more settlements as the Motor City heads in the right direction.
The city itself, especially the central core downtown, is thriving. Another 130 miles of city, we're huge. We're the size of Boston, New York, and San Francisco all together. City itself is going to take a period of time, but we're getting at it right now.
When the deal gets the final okay from a federal bankruptcy judge, Detroit will pay 74 cents for each dollar owed.
An important Senate hearing today as Comcast, the nation's biggest cable television provider, explained to lawmakers why it should be allowed to acquire Time Warner Cable, the nation's #2 cable company, and how consumers will benefit from the combined companies. But there was a lot of skepticism on Capitol Hill. Hampton Pearson has the story.
At the first public hearing on the proposed $45 billion merger between Comcast and Time Warner Cable, lawmakers on the Senate Judiciary Committee voiced concern about higher prices for consumers and too much power over what Americans watch on TV and online.
Consumers want to know whether a combined Comcast Time Warner will be in a better position to expand high-speed internet access. Will consumers have higher cable bills? will they have more or less content choices?
This issue literally touches people's lives every day, and it touches their wallets every month.
A post-merger Comcast would have about 30 million cable subscribers, just under 30% of the pay TV market, and serve anywhere between 20 to 40% of the high-speed internet market, but not at the expense of consumer choice. A top executive from Comcast says that's because the competitive landscape is changing.
While this transaction will make us bigger, that's a good thing, not a problem. Most of our real competitors are national and global and larger than us, like the Bells, satellite companies Apple, Google, Sony, and Netflix.
However, critics at today's hearing repeatedly pointed to Comcast ownership of NBC Universal and the ability to leverage that content as another potential obstacle.
So the transaction could fundamentally undermine these new, wonderful, innovative options consumers are seeing. Comcast, with its control of video and high-speed broadband, adding Time Warner systems, could lock in increased high prices for NBCU programming and sports and regional sports and cable programming.
The real audience for today's hearing, top regulators and lawyers at the FCC and Justice Department. They will have the final word on one of the biggest proposed media mergers in history. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Hampton Pearson in Washington.
And we should point out that Comcast is the parent company of CNBC, which produces this program.
And coming up on Nightly Business Report, why a small fraction of doctors get a big share of Medicare payments and why it matters to you. Some car troubles to tell you about. Toyota is recalling more than 6.5 million cars worldwide. This involves 30 different models in all for a variety of problems ranging from faulty airbags to defective steering columns to bad starter switches. Meanwhile, Volkswagen ordered its U.S. dealers to stop selling 27,000 newly manufactured Jettas, Beetles, and Passats. These are the ones with 1.8-liter engines and automatic transmission. The reason, the transmission oil may leak and cause a fire.
Ally Financial pricing its initial public offering this evening. The company offering 95 million shares at $25 each. That is at the low end of the estimated pricing range. The IPO will raise more than $2 billion. You may recall that Ally is the former General Motors financing arm that was forced to take a government bailout after betting big, and I do mean big, on subprime mortgages. The government needed to raise $1.9 billion to break even.
It's expected to be the busiest week for initial public offerings in more than 7 years, and we begin tonight's Market Focus with two companies that had successful trading debuts today. First, we look at La Quinta. Shares of this Blackstone-backed hotel operator got off to a bumpy start. They fell 4% in early trading after pricing below the expected range. But then shares rebounded, and the company raised $650 million from the offering. The stock rose a fraction to $17.12. Meanwhile, the IPO of Chinese firm iKang Healthcare rose sharply. It priced its 11 million shares at $14 apiece. Now, iKang is China's largest private operator of medical exams and disease screening centers. The stock surged 8.5% to $15.20. Constellation Brands' quarterly profits came in better than expected, thanks to strong sales of Corona and Modelo beer in the U.S. But the company says it'll spend over $1 billion, almost double what it expected, to increase capacity at a Mexican brewery. Well, that worried investors. Shares fell 1% to $80.64.
No kisses for Hershey's today. Investors went south on Hershey after a downgrade out of Goldman Sachs. The firm lowered its rating on the chocolate maker to sell from neutral, saying its strong run is about to end. The stock off nearly 3%, 98.91 the close. Another candy maker, Mars, is buying the bulk of 3 of Procter & Gamble's pet food brands. Mars already owns some pet care companies, but the new additions of Iams and other names will beef up that unit. The $3 billion sale is part of an effort by Procter & Gamble to concentrate on its most profitable core businesses. Shares of P&G rose slightly to 81.49. Mars is private. Bed Bath & Beyond, I love the Beyond department there, posted disappointing earnings after the bell. The home furnishing retailer saw sales decrease in the fourth quarter, earnings in line with estimates, but the company's revenue missed and its outlook came in weaker than expected. Shares fell initially. In the after-hours session, the stock ended the regular trading day up a fraction at 67.91.
A head-turning report about how much some individual doctors have been reimbursed for treating Medicare patients, including one Florida ophthalmologist who was repaid $21 million in just 1 year. Scott Cohn has more.
There's no question Salomon Melgen of West Palm Beach is successful, a board-certified ophthalmologist with 4 eye clinics in South Florida, treating presidents, governors, politicians, celebrities, according to his website. Salomon Melgen is also the top-billing individual Medicare provider in the country, collecting nearly 21 million taxpayer dollars in 2012 alone. Newly released data on more than 800,000 providers, information the government kept under wraps for decades, is shedding new light on a $900 billion system, and some say showing just how flawed it is.
Look, in a system where doctors are reimbursed for every single treatment, every single drug they provide, there's this incentive, as you say, to provide more care.
While some of the biggest payments went to labs and ambulance services, a handful of individual doctors, like Dr. Melgen, raked in millions. More than $18 million for a Florida cardiologist, $12 million for a New Jersey pathologist. New York radiologist Eric Schnipper was nowhere close, collecting about $520,000. But he says releasing all the data in raw form isn't fair.
It's based on gross income. In other words, it's not net. So, for example, there's no accounting for how much money it costs the physician to provide that service.
The numbers can be deceiving. Doctors bill Medicare based on set reimbursement rates that have repeatedly been cut. Take away the doctor's cost for a drug or a procedure, and Medicare can be a money loser. Nonetheless, fraud is rampant. Federal authorities recovered a record $4.3 billion last year, and that just scratches the surface. Salomon Melgen has been under a federal investigation over his Medicare billing, though his attorney says the doctor always billed in conformity with Medicare rules. The head of the American Medical Association worries about painting all doctors with the same brush.
We have to be very careful. The data's got to be correct. It has to be used properly.
But the Obama administration, which released data on hospital billing last year, defends this latest release, saying it will help policymakers and the public to follow the money. Scott Cohn, Nightly Business Report.
Joining us now to help put the data from this Medicare report into context is Christina Bocuti. She's Senior Associate with the Kaiser Family Foundation. Ms. Bocuti, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
This is an irresistible database. I spent part of the afternoon looking at my doctors and my family's doctors to see how much revenue they pulled in from Medicare. But I guess the simple question for you is, what am I to make of these numbers, and is their size necessarily telling in any way?
Well, what you make of the data and what other researchers make of the data can have different purposes. So I think what can come from this data is some analysis of variation in how many patients each doctor and other kinds of providers like physical therapists see, and by patients, these are all Medicare patients, and how many services they provide to each patient. And you'll see that it varies not just within a community, but each provider within a community, but it also varies across the country in a variety of ways.
You know, Christina, let me just follow up on what Tyler was asking you, because I did the same thing. I was also inputting my doctors, and I'm just wondering, how are consumers supposed to use this data? You know, until now, none of us really knew why one drug company charges one price and another one charges something else for the same drug, or why a doctor charges for, you know, this hip replacement one price and another one charges a lot more. You know, it's been no way to compare, but how can consumers use this data? Now, it seems like it's a Consumer Reports type of a beginning, at least, for some kind of indexing like that.
Well, the data right now that CMS has put out isn't extraordinarily user-friendly, but I imagine that several other organizations are going to quickly help consumers use it in an easier way. But the consumers could look at the data and be able to see the average prices that Medicare pays for the various services that they might be interested in, or how much Medicare has paid that doctor, and also how much combined the doctor is paid with the coinsurance and Medicare portion. But those fees are generally set by Medicare. They vary for a few different reasons, but their variation is based on where they're provided and in what setting. So patients should be able to look at it and see more how many services the provider is providing during the year. And also it could help predict what kinds of costs the patient might expect going to that doctor.
There are lots of anomalies in the data. For example, I believe in the case of the ophthalmologist in Cohn's report there, he was prescribing a quite expensive ophthalmic drug when another drug, comparable according to many physicians, would have worked just as well. But the peculiarity in the data, in the numbers, is that Medicare pays more for a more expensive drug. Are there instances here as well where a doctor might have been billed or received payment from Medicare for procedures performed by other people in his practice, like at the Mayo Clinic, for example?
Well, that's possible. The physicians can have a large practice where they have other providers that are working under supervision to them. For example, some nurse practitioners can provide services under supervision. They can also provide services and bill separately, independently. But if they're providing services under the supervision of the physician, then the billing can be under the physician's name. And so it can be that they see more patients that way.
Christina, thank you for helping with this tonight. We appreciate it. Christina Bocuti, Kaiser Family Foundation.
And coming up next, the lengths and costs that companies are going in order to make sure your transactions are secure. That's next.
It is being called one of the most serious internet security flaws ever. A computer bug known as Heartbleed has been found inside encryption programming codes at up to 2/3 of all active website servers. The bug may have exposed the personal information of millions of users, including passwords, credit card data, and even email addresses, to hackers. Internet users are now being advised to change their passwords and keep a close eye on any activity in their bank accounts.
Well, it's official now. Bank of America has been fined nearly $800 million by federal regulators after being accused of pressuring customers to sign up for costly credit card security services that they didn't need. B of A is the fifth major U.S. bank to settle credit card abuse allegations with the comptroller of the currency.
After the massive data breach at Target stores and at chains like Neiman Marcus and Michaels, retailers are rushing to make their cash registers and mobile payment systems more secure. Courtney Reagan went to the Transact conference in Las Vegas, where the biggest names in retail and cybersecurity are looking to restore consumer confidence.
The Electronic Transactions Association's Transact conference brings every part of a payment network together: credit cards, banks, payment processors, regulators, and retailers, all talking about securing spending while pointing fingers at each other for bearing the cost and the liability. Many retailers have had payment and data security teams in place for years and have been migrating, albeit slowly, to payment systems capable of using EMV technology. This allows systems to read chips and PIN cards similar to networks currently used outside the U.S. Visa and MasterCard are giving retailers until October of 2015 to put an EMV system in place. Otherwise, the liability for fraudulent purchases shifts to the retailers.
There will be enormous problems getting everything done by October 15th of 2015. It's not going to happen.
Though the world's largest retailer says it's already in the process of converting its systems. As of 2 weeks ago, Walmart turned on software at 1,000 U.S. locations, enabling point-of-sale systems to accept chip and PIN cards. The retailer says its whole network of stores will be ready to accept EMV cards before the end of the year. Because Walmart's current point-of-sale hardware is already compatible with EMV, the cost of turning on the software isn't material. Target, however, has said accelerating chip and PIN technology is part of a $100 million effort to ready all 1,800 locations to accept EMV cards by the first quarter of next year. Now, migrating payment systems to chip and PIN technology isn't cheap.
If we have to go to a chip card system, however, we're probably talking $5 billion for the banks and another $25 to $30 billion for the retailers.
Is that cost prohibitive in relation to the damage that can happen to your company if you're breached? But if they get hacked and their customers' card numbers become counterfeited, now they have major damage to their brand. So that's what's driving people to focus now on EMV.
EMV isn't necessarily a cure-all to prevent data breaches and hackers, but it does add a layer of encryption not currently in place in the U.S., and maybe some peace of mind for customers. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Courtney Reagan in Las Vegas, Nevada.
And that'll do it for Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Tyler Matheson. Thanks for watching.
And I'm Susie Garob. Have a great evening, everyone. We'll be right back here. See you tomorrow. I'm Susie Garob with the Nightly Business Report News Brief. Wall Street got a lift today from the Federal Reserve. Minutes from the central bank's last meeting indicated that policymakers will not raise interest rates anytime soon. And that sent stocks soaring. The Dow shot up 181 points. The Nasdaq rose 71. That's a spike of nearly 2%. And the S&P added 20 points. Washington released how much individual health care providers were reimbursed by Medicare, including one Florida eye doctor who was paid $21 million in 1 year. Toyota has recalled more than 6.5 million cars, 30 models in all, for a variety of safety problems. And Visa says the average household will spend $978 on this year's high school prom, and that's 14% lower than last year. Be sure to tune into Nightly Business Report right here on your public television station.